Hello, everybody, and welcome to Collaborative Practice, Critical Information Literacies and Open Pedagogy. My name is Erin Fields, and I am the Open Education and Scholarly Communications Librarian at the University of British Columbia Library, the Vancouver campus. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I work and live on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. As we are working virtually today, I'd like to acknowledge that here in the lower BC mainland, we are often on the unceded territories of many different Coast Salish peoples. And outside of this area, we may also be on traditional lands of many different Indigenous peoples. So when I acknowledge being on the territory of the Musqueam, it is rooted in an understanding that I, as a member of the UBC community, am privileged to be working on territories that are not my own. Additionally, as someone who works on the topic of open education, I also like to acknowledge that much of open education is grounded in Western notions of copyright and ownership, and these notions can be in tension with Indigenous and traditional ways of knowing. So while we won't be exploring these tensions in this session, I do like to state that I recognize that these tensions can exist and that we should always be aware of critically evaluating them. So just to start right away, defining open pedagogy is challenging. There's very little agreement on what open pedagogy is. And while this can in some ways complicate matters when we are trying to discuss how to implement the practice of open pedagogy into a classroom, I believe it is also fitting that it is a complicated idea to define, as it promotes criticism and discussion. And the major tenet of open pedagogy is that knowledge is fluid and it's dynamic. So by having to investigate defining open pedagogy, I believe it allows people to interpret and investigate and work within the space without a lot of restraint. I will say my definition of open pedagogy is based on my research, and I'm sure it doesn't encompass all conceptions of open pedagogy. So now, having said that, what is open pedagogy? Open pedagogy is heavily influenced by social constructivism and critical pedagogy, as well as open as a movement. I don't really have time today to really provide a good overview of both the theoretical areas, but what we can see in the literature is that open pedagogy includes themes of critiquing information privilege and authority, breaking down hierarchies to engage in collaborative dialogue in the classroom so that teacher-student binary is broken down, critical analysis of power imbalances in information and in information institutions, and the empowerment of students for themselves, but also the betterment of society. But the uniqueness of open pedagogy from other theoretical educational perspectives is its focus on openness and its application in the open education movement through the use of technologies. The open access that movement empowered scholars to claim their intellectual property rights and remove permissions barriers for the use and reuse of their work. Now, with the growth of open education movement, the principles of removing these barriers remain a fundamental goal with the creation of open educational resources. The creation of OER was integral to the social justice commitment to break down access to education barriers through delivery of no-cost education resources. However, the OER movement really didn't address innovation in teaching and learning practices within the classroom. Open pedagogy builds upon the social justice commitments of open access with the creation and use of OERs, but also invites students to be active participants and collaborators in the creation process, aligning education practices one moment, having a bit of a technical difficulty. So let me start off here again. So open pedagogy, it builds upon that social justice commitment of open access with the creation and use of OERs, but invites students to be active participants and collaborators in the creation process, aligning education practice to the foundations of critical pedagogy. So finally, in open pedagogy, where Some more technical difficulties. Finally, in open pedagogy, where open access is a fundamental principle, network technologies provide an opportunity for large-scale participation regardless of credentials or association to an institution. So this empowers voices that have been excluded from knowledge creation and sharing. So our institutions are at, in fact, barriers themselves. So while network technologies provide the vehicle for participation and sharing, open pedagogy requires authentic student and centered learning with these technologies and emphasizes the importance of peer-to-peer dynamics with more experienced contributors like instructors or knowledgeable peers as mentors to those with less experience. Now, I did put an asterisk next to use of network technologies to share, because although open pedagogy does often talk about network technologies, I don't think it's necessary that open pedagogy actually includes network technologies, and I'll give an example of that later. So now critical information literacy, and critical information literacy really came from librarianship, and it does also draw upon that idea of social constructivism and critical pedagogy, similar to open pedagogy. But the focus is on applying these perspectives in information systems. So critical information literacy and librarianship focuses on instructional practice that addresses how information is constructed, how it's contextualized by society. So there's our political systems, our social systems, cultural dimensions of how information is created and made viable in our society. And it prompts students to think about how these forces and how knowledge is created and used. So this is far different than how information literacy originally was taught by librarians, which was first conceived by focusing on tools-based approaches and skill development. So we would teach them how to find a thing to use in a paper, but there was really no critical reflection about those things or the tools to find. Critical information literacy really encourages engagement and reflection of the social construction of knowledge, similar to open pedagogy, how the production and dissemination of information is impacted by information authorities, and the critical evaluation of how information is organized and structured. So for librarianship, the principles of critical information literacy then change our role from being skilled developers and problem solvers. So where we're ensuring that students know how to find an article for their paper, we're transitioning more to be problem posers that seek students' reflection, critique, and insight into the process of finding and using information. So that's a little different than just finding information. We're talking about reflecting on how you found it and the kind of information that you have. So through the overview I just provided you, you can see how open pedagogy and critical information literacy really align in terms of theoretical objectives. But what about the practical outputs of a classroom engaging in both open pedagogy and critical information literacy? So open pedagogy has a unique focus, and it's the commitment to create and openness by empowering learners to collaborate on building new knowledge and sharing that knowledge. So this creates a unique opportunity for critical information literacy to actually be put into action. So we're not only critiquing information systems and information itself, but we're having students actively work to change those systems by creating information themselves and sharing it openly. So through open pedagogy, critical information literacy can move beyond just critical reflective practice to authentic action. So if critical information literacy aligns with open pedagogy, the focus on participation through the creation of information objects not only has students seeking and evaluating information sources, but they can engage in critically understanding the tools for information creation and organization. So they're not only finding information and creating information, but they're now sharing it using those tools. So through the process of creation, students have to make decisions on how their information will be showcased, how it will be described and interacted with. And these decisions can yield a greater understanding of how information tools work within systems that have defined values and structures of authority. So as students engage with openly sharing information objects, they create connections with communities outside of their information or outside of their classroom. This adds value to the information landscape. So we're adding value to the world by sharing our information out to the world, by also inviting further critical dialogue. And this really reflects kind of academic practice, if you think about it, because students now have to negotiate diverse ideas and perspectives. So if they share something and somebody responds to it, it's almost like a peer review critical analysis process going on. Now, if students engage in using network, open collaborative technologies to create information like, say, a wiki, the students have the ability to modify other contributors' work to reflect how information evolves over time as new information comes to light. So they can actually make direct changes immediately. So then when teaching closed information systems like the library catalog or like a database, you can start having discussions of value and authority and power can occur, but changing those systems is not swift and it's not open for the public. Like libraries have been around since the 17th century. So we have a very structured approach to how information gets into a library. A student isn't able to make changes to that system. Sometimes we can't even make changes to that system quickly. So including diverse voices that reflect how communities identify and describe themselves can't occur within systems that aren't open and collaboratively developed. So for example, with a Wikipedia, you can actually make edits in real time without many editorial barriers. You can't do that inside of our traditional publishing systems. This provides an opportunity for students to reflect on diverse experience with transforming the information landscape through creating and improving upon underrepresented subjects. So they can decide how something is described. They can influence the kind of information that is out in the world much more than they could inside of a closed system. So finally, creation of information offers an authentic opportunity for students to investigate issues of intellectual property, copyright, information security, privacy, and freedom of information by situating these topics and experiences of the students openly sharing their work. So this provides students with an authentic experience of these information issues because it pertains to their own creative practice. They're more invested. So now they have to know about their own intellectual property and how that impacts when they share openly. So that was a lot of heavy sort of theoretical work. So what does this actually look like in practice? And I'm going to show course integration of open pedagogy and critical information literacy within 3 projects that I've worked on. So first, for the FNIS Wikipedia gap analysis and editing, FNIS 220 is a course that explores the ways Indigenous people seek to overcome the legacies of settler colonialism and claim sovereignty. And they do this through examining our contemporary articulations of Indigenous identity, politics, culture, and tradition in the fields of literature, film, and video games. So working with Dr. David Gartner, we developed a Wikipedia-based assignment that incorporated both open pedagogy and critical information literacy. The assignment contained 3 parts: Wikipedia gap analysis, a group editing activity, and a personal reflection. So how did open pedagogy and critical information literacy enact through these activities? Well, students worked together in the analysis and editing of Wikipedia with facilitated discussion and guidance from myself and David. The assignment focused on evaluating the reflection, not the product, which prioritized the critical analysis of information and information systems. So the gap analysis content really assisted the students in developing edits to Wikipedia, which were not really graded. But those edits mattered because they were inside of that open system. Students had facilitated discussions that unpacked traditional information systems and Wikipedia as comparative tools. Students also reflected on the relative success and failures of open systems like Wikipedia by discussing community norms and conventions that impacted what was written and what wasn't, how it was described, and how it was made openly available. So for the gender, race, sexuality, social justice zines, this was for a course, Social Justice Course 102, which was an introduction to social justice issues. And it was in partnership with Dr. Jessie Taylor. The course required students to create, in groups of 7 to 10, a zine on social justice topics with at least 4 pages of original writing and content per person. So what was the integration with open pedagogy and critical information literacy here? Well, the outputs of the zines were in physical form. So this is where the network technologies really don't apply. But the open aspect to these assignments included a community zine fair, the addition of the student zines to the Vancouver Public Library zine collection, and the invitation of 2 zine collectives to participate in the fair. Since the zines frequently use methods such as collage, they're a great case for opening up discussions about copyright, intellectual property and attribution, cultural appropriations and art forms, traditional versus community information creation practices. And these are subjects that, because of their complexity, are really often difficult to teach, especially to undergraduate communities, because they are complex. But what was interesting here is because they were creating an open information object, we got to have more authentic discussion. So for example, we engaged in a facilitated discussion around cultural materials and appropriative practices, and it worked collectively to co-develop a structure around using cultural materials inside of the zines. So finally, the Holocaust Artifact Encyclopedia was a partnership with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center and a faculty member in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies. The course was German representations of the Holocaust, and it had students engaging in analyzing and writing about artifacts from the In Focus exhibit in support of the development of an online encyclopedia. So the integration of open pedagogy and critical information literacy, it's similar to the Wikipedia-based assignment and the zine assignment. This assignment raised issues related to intellectual property, but also open license attribution and sharing in the final creation of the encyclopedic entry. A unique aspect to this assignment was understanding the social, cultural, and ethical and political nature of engaging in culturally sensitive materials within museums. So this allowed students to really delve into issues of working with cultural artifacts and open sharing. So for example, during the workshops, we had the students think about how museums display objects that have potential to re-victimize those with personal connection to them and the context they were created, and in this instance, the Holocaust. So in this context, we worked together to have discussions around how does the history of artifacts and the purpose of the museum impact what you will write? And how does the fact that the resource you are creating will be openly available for others to read and reuse within their own work? And this asked students to really think about the impacts of information institutions like a museum, the trust they secure, and the power that they have that could be positive or negatively impacted by making visible or invisible, or contextualizing or not contextualizing the objects within their care. So that actually will be the conclusion to my discussion. I'm open to any questions you have. I also have a very long reference list should anybody be interested in digging in a bit deeper, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. And I will stop sharing to make that easier. Here we go. I absolutely will share my reference list, and I'll share it through, I think Sketch has that ability. Do I have pictures of the zine project? I absolutely do. And one part of the project that I didn't mention, which I really enjoyed, was students created their own copyright statements about their work. And it was really reflective and really incorporated sort of social justice as a part of their themes inside of copyright, which was very interesting. But I can definitely share those as well.
Yes, hello. Hello?
Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate you for a very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
And I was just wondering for critical information literacy, if there's any kind of application that you know of at, with the STEM discipline. I mean, science, technology, and engineering. Do you know of any application of faculty using
Using critical information literacy, absolutely, especially when it starts coming to talking about open science, open research, open data. We're seeing a lot of these conversations come up because currently right now inside of open science, open data, open research, there's not a great deal of conversations about ethics related to openness. Openness is seen more as a desired outcome rather than a considered approach. So what we're seeing in terms of the critical information literacy piece that is being added in STEM has a lot to do around questions of openness inside of the STEM communities and when openness should be a consideration and when it should not. And we're also seeing a lot of work with critical information literacy around citizen science as well. So engaging in those community-based programs that can incorporate those kind of conversations in addition. We have many examples at UBC where these sort of integrations are happening, and we have a website called Open UBC that provides the examples of these applications. And again, I can share that out, that web resource. Cool.
That would be really great. I have a doctoral student right now who's doing a dissertation on this topic. I may probably share your information with her as well. But thank you so much. It was
Absolutely.
very informative. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I also shared my email. I'm happy for anybody to contact me to discuss more.
Great.
I shared it in the chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Just scrolling back to see questions. Yes, you can find all the assignments to what I'm speaking about from that Open UBC, so open.ubc.ca website. We provide examples of all of our integrations of open and open pedagogy and critical information literacy through our gallery there. Might be easier if people would be willing to maybe, if you have a question, you can unmute and ask me because I'm having a hard time scanning back. So if you do have a question, feel free to unmute and just feel free to ask. Oh yeah, the question about the encyclopedic entries and the artifact, absolutely shared on that Open UBC website.
I have a question. This is Jackie Kaysen from Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm curious how your larger community feels about that level of openness. I know there's a push toward proprietary patenting in the sciences and campuses that are down on budget, you know, their budgets have not been replenished as much. And I think maybe selling that idea of openness, that's actually what the public pays for in a public institution. And I don't know if you've had those kinds of larger conversations.
Yeah, we have. Unfortunately, that debate is not the thing that actually sinks in with our research communities as much. Where we're finding more traction is as we relate, say, openness, particular to open science and open research as it relates to what is it, reproducibility and replicability. That's where we're getting much more traction. And also the fact that so many granting institutions are requiring a portion of openness actually a part of their workflows. So where we start talking about openness in particular in STEM is we're actually talking it about as being integrated into a part of your workflow process for science. So that organizational processes and how that impacts grant funding. That's when we're starting to see more pickup. Not as much with the debates around public funding of institutions, public funding of research. That seems to fall a bit on deaf ears, I think, in a lot of ways when it comes to the sciences part. For open education tends to have a lot of buy-in automatically. The questions or issues around that sort of piece is usually related to time, cost and efforts. Open, although it's open, does not mean it's open free of cost. So we get a lot of those kind of pushbacks, but not around the conception, like the philosophical kind of social justice piece. Nobody wants students to not have access to resources. So it's less of a problem there. Open access in terms of journals, book material, that is just always going to be a slow moving target, I feel, until our publishing systems and our tenure and promotion processes are not so tied to metric outputs. So that has always been a slow conversation. Open education seems to be the one piece that actually seems to be the easiest for our faculty to kind of latch onto.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hate to interrupt, but we are at time for this session. So I'm going to stop the recording in just a moment, but the conversation can continue informally if you'd like to stick around and ask more questions.